Jake had been on Zelrosha for just a few days, but already he had learned one thing: the Zelroshans did not like humans. Their entire society was built around intellectual purity, technological superiority, and cultural refinement. And above all, they had one law that couldn't be broken: no romantic or physical contact with humans. Jake couldn't help but find that ironic, especially because he was starting to get very physical with one of their most prominent diplomats, Lyria. When they first met, it had been strictly professional. He'd been there to negotiate a treaty between his planet and theirs, nothing more. But the moment Jake laid eyes on Lyria, with her bioluminescent skin and strikingly sharp features, he couldn't help himself. She was beautiful in a way that was so alien, it made every human woman seem plain in comparison. And yet, despite her cool, confident exterior, he could tell she was interested. Just the faintest blush on her cheeks when their hands brushed had told him all he needed to know. Their first encounter had been strictly formal, the typical pleasantries exchanged, but Jake couldn't resist dropping a little joke. "I bet your species has some pretty strict touching rules, huh?" he said, his grin widening. Lyria's expression stiffened for a moment before she replied with a cool, "We prefer to keep it hands off, human." The way she said it made him want to test those boundaries. He had his ways, after all. Jake had always been good at getting under people's skin, especially women. He was charming, charismatic, and damn good at wordplay. He wasn't naive enough to think he'd get Lyria to break the rules easily. But there was something about the way she looked at him, the way her eyes would flicker to his lips or linger on his hands, that told him she was fighting something. It was delicious. The challenge made it all the more enticing. The next meeting came a few days later. It was supposed to be about the peace treaty, but Jake had other plans. He could see the way Lyria was starting to crack. She wasn't as composed as she wanted him to think. Jake knew how to speak to a woman, especially one as proud and restrained as Lyria. He figured the more normal and nonchalant he seemed, the more likely she was to drop her guard. They met in a sleek, high-tech conference room, where every surface was smooth, reflective, and sterile, just the kind of environment Lyria loved. He leaned in slightly as they exchanged notes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off her. It wasn't an accident. Jake was working it, and it was working. Lyria's hand brushed against his as she reached for the data pad. She froze. Her body stiffened for just a second, and Jake couldn't help but smile. "So," Jake said, his voice smooth, teasing, "your species is big on purity, huh? I guess that means no touching allowed." He leaned closer, lowering his voice deliberately. "Does that mean we can't even talk about breaking the rules?" Lyria's jaw tightened, her gaze narrowing slightly. "There are rules for a reason, human. You don't just touch something without consequences." She said it with authority, but Jake could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She was intrigued. The moment was palpable. "Ah," Jake said, leaning back with a grin. "You Zelroshans are all about control, aren't you? Must be tough, holding back all that desire." His words were a soft challenge, playful yet loaded. He was throwing everything he had at her now, testing how far she'd go before she cracked. Lyria's expression remained unreadable, but there was a subtle tremble in her voice when she spoke again. "I don't know what you think you're implying, but I suggest you focus on the matters at hand." The way she said it wasn't dismissive. It was almost defensive. Jake leaned in, just enough for her to feel the warmth of his presence. "Oh, I'm sure you do. But every time we meet, it feels like we're negotiating something a little more personal." His voice dropped to a low murmur. "You don't mind if we negotiate a little, do you?" For a moment, there was silence between them. Jake could feel the tension building like a storm on the horizon. Lyria, despite herself, was reacting. Her breath caught, her eyes flickering between his lips and his gaze. She was aware, intensely aware of the line they were both walking. Then, Lyria shifted, crossing her arms over her chest as if to guard herself against his proximity. "I'm not some object for your amusement, human," she said sharply, but her voice wavered just the slightest bit. Jake, sensing the opening, smiled wider. "I don't think you're an object," he replied, his tone softening. I think you're something more. Something untouchable. And that's exactly what makes me want to touch. Lyria's eyes darkened, and she turned her back to him, walking towards the window. It was a defensive move, but Jake could see her shoulders tense as she stared out at the city below, her mind racing. For a moment, Jake thought she might leave. But she didn't. Instead, she stood there, her back to him, silent. It was almost as if she was waiting for something, maybe for him to make the next move. You don't have to do this, she said, her voice barely a whisper. You know the consequences. Jake took a step forward, his voice low, coaxing. I think the consequences are what make it more fun. Lyria turned to face him, her gaze fierce, but Jake could see the slight tremble in her lips. She wasn't immune. He could see it in the way her eyes softened when they met his, how she subtly leaned closer as if drawn to him despite herself. You're dangerous, human, she said, her voice full of restraint. You don't know what you're doing. Jake took another step closer, now inches away from her. I know exactly what I'm doing, he said, almost tenderly. I'm making you feel. Lyria's breath hitched. Her resolve faltered. You can't be serious, she whispered, but there was something different in her tone now. Something uncertain. Something yearning. Jake reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. Lyria flinched, but only slightly, her body betraying her thoughts. Just one touch, Jake murmured, his voice a low caress. You've felt it too, haven't you? This connection? For a brief moment, it felt as though the entire universe paused. She didn't pull away. Her voice broke through the tension, soft and unsure. What if I can't stop? Jake smiled, his heart racing. Then maybe it's time we both stopped pretending. Their fingers entwined, and the touch lingered, sending a jolt of electricity between them. Neither of them spoke for a moment, both feeling the gravity of what had just happened, what was about to happen. It was the beginning of something neither of them could control, a forbidden attraction that could tear them both apart, or make them burn together. In that moment they both knew, there was no going back. Jake knew the stakes were high. He wasn't just flirting with Lyria, he was crossing a line that neither of them could afford to cross, at least not openly. Zelrosha's laws on interspecies relations were absolute, their penalties severe. Yet, standing so close to Lyria, feeling the heat of her skin just inches away, it was hard to think of anything other than the undeniable pull between them. Lyria, ever the disciplined diplomat, stood with her arms crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable. But Jake could see the conflict in her eyes, the flicker of something she refused to acknowledge, something that wasn't just desire but the undeniable attraction she had for him. The way her body had reacted when their hands brushed earlier, it was all there. But she wouldn't admit it. She couldn't. Jake didn't need her to admit it. He could see it in her eyes. He could feel it in the charged air between them. She was fighting it. And that made it all the more thrilling. You don't have to fight this, Jake said softly, his voice smooth, almost coaxing. You don't have to pretend like I'm just another human diplomat here for a treaty. Lyria stiffened, her gaze narrowing, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her expression. She turned away, the distance between them suddenly feeling much more significant. You misunderstand me, human, she said, her voice cold, but Jake noticed the tremor. He noticed everything. The way she kept glancing at him, the way her breath caught just a little when he spoke. Do I? Jake stepped forward again, just close enough to feel her presence, to smell her scent, something floral and heady, like a blooming flower on a distant planet. Because I think you've been misunderstanding yourself all along. Lyria shot him a sharp look. And what is that supposed to mean? Her voice was biting, but Jake knew she was close to losing her control. It means, Jake continued, moving just a bit closer, that despite everything you tell yourself, despite all the laws of your people, you feel this too. You feel it every time I touch you, every time I make you look at me like that. He reached out, brushing the back of his fingers against her arm in a casual, almost innocent gesture. But Lyria flinched as if she couldn't help herself. She quickly pulled away, but not quickly enough to hide the way her pulse had quickened. She turned to face him, eyes blazing. You think that just because I feel something doesn't mean I'm willing to break the laws of my people for you? You're wrong, human. You don't understand anything. Jake grinned, unabashed. Maybe I don't understand your laws, but I understand you. He stepped closer again, closing the gap that had formed between them. You're trying so hard to deny it. Trying to hold on to these rules that aren't yours, that don't even make sense. You're fighting yourself, Lyria. And I think you know it. She took a step back, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and something else, something deeper. I am following the laws of my people. I am stronger than you think, human. Her words were sharp, but there was no conviction behind them. Jake could feel it. Strong? Jake repeated with a soft chuckle. You think strength is ignoring what your body and your heart are telling you? He moved in closer, his voice lowering. You're fighting this attraction, but you know as well as I do that it's not something you can just ignore. Lyria's eyes darted to his lips before quickly snapping her gaze back to his eyes. Her mouth opened as though she were going to say something, but the words never came. She was caught in the tension between them, her thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. You don't understand how hard it is for me, she finally whispered, almost to herself. This isn't just about the laws, Jake. It's about who I am. What I am. I'm not just some human to be played with. I never said you were, Jake replied gently, though there was a smirk on his face. But I think you're underestimating yourself. You're not some cold, untouchable alien who's beyond anything a human could offer. You're just a woman, Lyria. A woman who happens to be gorgeous, smart, and maybe just a little bit tempted. Lyria's face flushed. Jake saw it, the way her breath hitched, the way her chest rose and fell. She wanted to push him away, to tell him to stop, but she couldn't. He had already broken through her defenses, and now she was left exposed. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was pulling her into his world, one where the rules didn't matter, and they were just two people, drawn to each other in a way that neither could fight forever. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to steady herself, but it didn't work. When she opened them again, her gaze was softer. You don't know what it's like, she murmured. To be constantly in control. To always have to be perfect. Jake stepped forward until they were nearly nose to nose. I don't need you to be perfect, Lyria. I just need you to be real. His hand brushed against hers again, and this time she didn't pull away. She didn't do anything. She simply let it happen. You're making it harder for me, Lyria said, her voice almost a whisper. Her fingers twitched, just barely brushing against Jake's hand. It was as if she wanted to take his hand, to touch him the way he had been touching her, but she was holding back. That's the idea, Jake said, a soft laugh escaping his lips. I'm good at making things harder, Lyria. You'll learn that about me. Her breath caught, and for a moment, Jake thought she might say something in protest. But instead, she just looked at him, her eyes full of that same intensity. The attraction was undeniable now, even to her. She wasn't fighting anymore. She was waiting. Waiting for him to make the next move, to push them both over the edge. Jake smiled again, his hand gently cupping her cheek, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath his palm. I've been waiting for you to give in, Lyria. You've been resisting me for far too long. Her lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she closed the distance between them. Her lips brushed his, barely a whisper of contact, but enough to make Jake's pulse race. She pulled away just as quickly, her eyes wide as if shocked at what she had just done. But the evidence of her desire was all around them. You don't have to say anything, Jake murmured, his lips curling into a grin. I already know what you want. And for the first time, Lyria didn't deny it. Lyria stood there, breathless, her heart hammering in her chest. Every instinct told her to pull away, to walk away, to preserve the reputation of her species, to maintain the sacred rules of Zelrosha. But as she gazed into Jake's eyes, all of that seemed to melt away. The conflict that had been boiling inside her for days, weeks, months, suddenly felt meaningless. Her body was betraying her, the very thing she had fought so hard to control. She knew she shouldn't be here. She knew she was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. But when Jake's hand gently cupped her face, when his thumb traced the delicate curve of her jaw, something in her mind clicked. The carefully constructed walls around her emotions, her discipline, crumbled like a house of cards. There was no turning back now. "You don't have to hide it," Jake whispered, his voice low, coaxing, like a smooth melody that worked its way into her soul. His words were soft but full of conviction. "I've seen it in your eyes. Every time I'm close to you, every time we talk, there's this thing between us. And you're just pretending you don't feel it." Lyria's lips parted, but no words came. She was trembling, a mix of anger, desire, and fear coursing through her veins. Her fingers twitched, the urge to touch him overwhelming, but she pulled back just slightly, as if testing herself. Testing him. "I can't. I shouldn't," she whispered, her voice faltering. Her mind raced. Every part of her was screaming for her to walk away, to restore order. She was a high-ranking diplomat, after all. She was supposed to represent the pinnacle of Zeroshan culture, their strength, their purity. Not get caught up in this dangerous, forbidden attraction with a human. "You're not fooling anyone," Jake said, his thumb still tracing the line of her jaw. "Not me. Not yourself. This isn't about the law, Lyria. It's about us. And right now, what matters isn't who we are, it's what we feel." Lyria's breath hitched at the sincerity in his voice. He wasn't trying to manipulate her, wasn't playing some game. He was real. And that was terrifying. She stepped back, as if putting some space between them could somehow stop this. But Jake wasn't about to let her go that easily. He reached for her hand, his fingers slipping around hers. He could feel the hesitation in her touch, but there was also something more, something undeniable. "You can't fight this," Jake said softly, his voice almost a plea. "Not anymore. I can see it. I can feel it. And you feel it too." Lyria's heart raced as his words sank in. Was it true? Was she really feeling something for him, something more than just the attraction of a human who dared to challenge her beliefs? She had told herself for so long that this asterisk, was impossible. That it could never happen. But now, standing here, with Jake's hand on hers, it felt like nothing else mattered. "You think you're the first human to try this with me?" she snapped suddenly, her defiance returning in full force. "You think you can just waltz into my life and tell me how I feel?" Jake smiled, not in arrogance but in quiet understanding. "No. But I think you're the first Zeroshan who's willing to admit that maybe there's something more than just a forbidden law. Something deeper. Something worth exploring." Lyria's chest tightened as she fought back the surge of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. There was something about Jake that was impossible to ignore. His confidence. His persistence. His respect for her, even in the face of everything that told him he should keep his distance. But she wasn't going to let him win that easily. She wasn't going to let him break her down with his words alone. She had worked too hard to build herself up, to hold on to her dignity. "I don't need your pity," she said sharply, her voice a mix of defensiveness and something else, something softer. Jake's eyes softened, and he stepped closer again. "It's not pity, Lyria," he said gently, his voice almost a whisper now. "It's respect. I respect you more than you know. I've never met anyone like you." The words hung in the air between them, thick with tension. Lyria's mind screamed at her to end this, to walk away before things got any more complicated, any more dangerous. But her body, her traitorous body, wanted nothing more than to close the gap between them. To let the heat, the chemistry, the magnetic pull between them take over. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. Her fingers tingled where Jake's hand still held hers, and for the briefest second, she let herself savor the sensation. She wasn't just feeling his touch physically, She was feeling his energy, his presence, his willingness to take this all the way. She had never met anyone like him before. I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. The vulnerability in her tone startled her as much as it startled Jake. But there it was. Her guard was slipping. And she couldn't stop it. Jake's hand moved to the back of her neck, his fingers gently threading through her hair. He tilted her head slightly, his touch soft but purposeful. "You don't have to do anything, Lyria. Just feel this. Feel us. I know you want to. I know you need to." Lyria's breath caught again, and she felt a rush of heat flood her body, straight to her core. The warmth from his touch was like a spark that ignited something deep inside her, something she had kept buried for so long. She had always been the strong one, the one in control, the one who resisted temptation. But now, standing here with Jake, she didn't want control anymore. She didn't want to fight. Before she could stop herself, her hands reached up to touch his chest. She felt the solid warmth of his body beneath her fingertips, the faint rhythm of his heartbeat. And then, without another word, she was moving closer, her lips finding his in a kiss that was urgent and desperate, full of need. Jake responded immediately, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her closer as he deepened the kiss. The heat between them became almost unbearable, a fire that neither could put out. Lyria's mind raced, but all she could focus on was the sensation of Jake's lips on hers, the way his hands moved over her body, gentle yet insistent. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Lyria let go of everything. She let go of the rules, the expectations, the burden of being perfect. She let herself be consumed by the moment, by the desire that she had fought for so long to ignore. And in that moment she knew she had crossed the point of no return. There was no going back. She had chosen this. Chosen him. But as their bodies moved together, as they both gave in to the undeniable chemistry between them, the reality of what they were doing, the consequences of it, still loomed over them, heavy and unspoken. Would it be worth it? Would the risk of breaking Zelrosian law be worth what they were about to do? Lyria didn't have an answer. But for now, she didn't care. She was lost in him, lost in the way his touch made her feel like she had never felt before. And for the first time, she felt alive. Lyria lay next to Jake, her heart still racing, the world around her spinning with the aftermath of what had just transpired. The room felt heavier, the air thick with the weight of their shared experience. Her mind, still reeling from the intensity of the moment, struggled to reconcile the emotions swirling within her. She had just broken the most sacred law of her people, the one rule that had governed her entire life. And for what? A moment of weakness? A fleeting desire she couldn't control? But as she glanced at Jake, his chest rising and falling in the quiet aftermath, a strange warmth spread through her. She had resisted him, fought against this pull, told herself time and time again that it was impossible, yet here she was. And in that moment she knew something had changed. It wasn't just physical attraction, there was something deeper, something raw and real that neither of them could deny anymore. Jake turned toward her, his eyes half-lidded but still full of that intensity, that confidence that seemed to radiate from him effortlessly. He didn't say anything at first, his fingers tracing small circles on her arm, as though savoring the silence, the space between them that had once felt so charged with tension and now seemed like a comforting lull. Lyria's lips parted as she shifted, propping herself up on one elbow, her gaze still locked on him. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, she exhaled slowly, her body still trembling slightly from the adrenaline, from the rush of emotions that had surged through her just moments ago. Jake seemed to sense her hesitation. He didn't push her, didn't rush her into saying anything. Instead, he simply reached out, brushing a strand of her hair behind her ear with the gentleness she hadn't expected from someone so human. His touch was soft, almost tender, and it caught her off guard. The whole situation felt surreal. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and sincere. It wasn't the teasing, cocky tone she had gotten used to. There was a certain softness there, a vulnerability that surprised her. Lyria nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she was okay. Her mind was still grappling with the enormity of what they had just done. I should be asking you that, she replied, her voice quiet, tinged with uncertainty. This wasn't supposed to happen. It's not what either of us expected. Jake chuckled softly, the sound warm and reassuring. Honestly? I'm not so sure what I expected, but I don't regret it. Not for a second. He reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers in a gesture that felt oddly comforting. I didn't think it would go this far, but now that it has. He paused, looking at her with a mixture of affection and something else, something deeper. I'm glad it did. Lyria blinked, taken aback by the sincerity in his words. She had always assumed that humans, with their fleeting emotions and short lives, were quick to jump into things, only to discard them when the thrill faded. But Jake was different. He was something else. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she felt a growing connection to him, something that tugged at her heartstrings in a way she had never experienced. But reality soon crashed back in. The weight of the consequences, the undeniable truth that they were breaking the most sacred law of her people, couldn't be ignored. Her species would never accept this. The Zelrotians were proud, dignified, and above all, they held the purity of their race in the highest regard. One indiscretion, one breach of the law, could ruin her. It could ruin everything she had worked for, everything she had built. I can't stay here, Lyria said, her voice suddenly sharp. She pushed herself up from the bed, the cool air hitting her skin like a shock. I don't belong here. Not like this. Jake frowned, sitting up as well, his concern evident. What do you mean? What's going on? We don't have to leave, Lyria. Whatever this is, we can figure it out. Together. Lyria shook her head, her thoughts swirling. She turned away from him, her back to him as she paced the small space. She was torn, caught between the undeniable pull she felt toward Jake and the weight of the laws that governed her life. She had always been a believer in order, in structure. This felt like chaos. You don't understand, she murmured, her voice tinged with frustration. This is bigger than you or me. It's bigger than us. There are rules, Jake. Rules that can't be broken. I can't just ignore them. I can't just forget everything that's at stake. Jake stood slowly, his expression shifting from concern to something more resolute. He moved toward her, but this time, he didn't touch her. He simply stood at a distance, watching her, as if trying to understand the storm raging inside her. I don't care about the rules, he said, his voice firm. All I care about is us. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. If it's about breaking the law, well, we'll figure that out. We're resourceful. Humans are resourceful. But you and I, what we have, that's real. And you can't deny it. Lyria closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words sink in. He was right in a way. There was something undeniable between them, something that went beyond the rules of her people, beyond the societal expectations that had been ingrained in her since birth. It was raw. It was real. And it terrified her. But more than that, it called to her. You really think we can make this work? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. She turned back to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and longing. Jake nodded, his gaze unwavering. I do. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm not saying there won't be consequences. But I know that what we have is worth it. Lyria felt something stir inside her, something she had long since buried. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could overcome this. Hope that she could be more than just a diplomat bound by law. That she could be someone who followed her heart, someone who could defy the expectations that had been set for her. But even as the words formed on her lips, she knew there was no easy path forward. The law was clear. The punishment for breaking it was severe. She could lose everything. Her family. Her career. Her standing in Zelrosian society. And yet, in Jake's eyes, she saw something else. Something that said there was more to life than rules. More than honor and duty. There was love. There was the chance to be truly free, to break away from everything that had been expected of her. Lyria took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked at Jake, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she made a decision. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She didn't know what the future would hold. She didn't know what would happen next. But one thing was certain, she couldn't fight this any longer. She couldn't deny what was in her heart. "We'll figure it out," she said softly, her voice steady now, resolute. "Together." Jake smiled, a slow, relieved smile. He stepped forward, his arms wrapping around her as if to hold her in place, to anchor her in the storm they had just created. And for the first time, Lyria didn't feel the need to resist. For the first time, she let herself be held, let herself be seen for who she truly was. And in that moment, she realized that sometimes, the only law that mattered was the one that came from the heart.